Hello and welcome to the show that gives you an insight into the top economic stories of the week. We try and do away with the jargon and bring you some much needed plain speak. You're watching Policy Watch. Before I introduce my guest this week, let's take a look at what made the headlines this past week. Our top story is the new set of guidelines issued by the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India with respect to the 2G spectrum auctions. Industry is up in arms over the recommendations. Is it a regressive regulatory misadventure? The other big story on the show this week is the negative outlook issued for India by rating agency Standard & Poor's. Is the so-called policy paralysis affecting India Inc.'s standing globally? And will this provide the push needed to kickstart the reform engine? And we'll top it off with some good news for employees. The Ministry of Labour is all set to increase the interest on the Employee Provident Fund. My guest this week is Paranjoy, Guha, Thakurta, senior journalist and author. This is your first time on the show, Paranjoy. It's a pleasure having you on the show. Before we start off into the first story of the show, I'd like to ask you, on one second story, the S&P's negative outlook. Do you think India should be worried at all?
It was expected. I mean, everybody was expecting something like this to happen. The macroeconomic indicators in this country had deteriorated over the recent past, so one should not be surprised that this has happened, whether it be in terms of GDP growth, whether in terms of current account deficit, all these indicators which are it's not that I consider these to be the best indicators of the state of the economy, but certainly credit rating agencies do look at these indicators.
Right.
And these indicators had worsened. So personally, I'm not surprised that this has happened. At the same time, I don't give it so much importance.
Right. Fair point. We'll come to that story in just a bit. We'll do a top story first. Now, after the Supreme Court cancelled 122 scam-tainted 2G spectrum licenses, India's Telecom Regulatory Authority, TRAI, has issued a new set of recommendations following a directive by the Apex Court. TRAI has put the total estimate of the value of spectrum auctions at 7 times the amount garnered by the government in the previous round of auctions. Policy Watch team filed a report. Take a look.
The Telecom Regulatory Authority of India, TRAI, has issued a fresh set of recommendations as per the Supreme Court's directive on 2G spectrum licenses. This time around, spectrum shall be offered in blocks of 1.25 MHz each. According to media reports, the Telecom Authority has pegged the value of 2G spectrum at 7 lakh crore rupees, almost 7 times of the amount that the government actually received from the sale of 2G spectrum during A. Raja's tenure as the telecom minister. TRAI has set the spectrum's reserve price at 4,500 crores and has recommended that auctions should be phased out over a period of 3 years. The auctions will be open for all companies and the usage charges for telcos for all spectrum bought via the auction has been set at 1%. The previous rate of annual charges was 8%. In what could be a boon for telcos under financial stress, TRAI has also recommended that an initial payment of 25% is acceptable with a 2-year moratorium and the rest can be paid over a period of 10 years.
Even though the estimated revenue will give the government a windfall that could ease its fiscal troubles, the big question in everybody's mind is whether tariffs will shoot up if the guidelines are accepted. With Athar Khan, Rahul Kapoor for Rajya Sabha TV.
So, Paranjoy, you saw the story. Obviously, this week, the biggest story was the TRAI recommendation. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of it, first thoughts on these recommendations, these new guidelines. Telcos are up in arms. Do you agree with them when they call these set of guidelines a regressive regulatory step?
See, from their point of view, they're obviously unhappy that their costs are going to go up. So the way they sort of make a big hue and cry about it is now they're arguing that this is going to increase. This extra, the higher costs are going to be passed on to
the consumer.
But let's step back a little bit. When these licenses were issued in the first place on the 10th of January 2008, the letters of intent, which subsequently became licenses, they were grossly undervalued at that point of time itself. Because at that point of time, in January 2008, these were prices that had been discovered 7 years earlier. And in this period of time, the market had really boomed. It had gone up by 7 times. So even in January 2008, the spectrum was valued at least 7 times the market price. How do we know this? Because these are the prices that Telenor paid for its stake in Uninor, which was the Unitech company. The same thing happened with Etisalat of the United Arab Emirates, the price it paid for what was called Swan, which later became DB Realty, and even Japan's entity Docomo in the tie-up with the Tata. So what was clear was that even at that point of time, these were grossly undervalued. Now what has happened, Mr. Raja issued all these licenses saying it's going to bring in competition, I'm going to break the cartel, but that didn't really happen because these 122 licensees, they barely got 12% of the market about, between 2008 and then 2012. By the time the licenses were cancelled, there's another important thing that happened. The TRAI has said that this spectrum, you're now going to use, you can use it for anything, not just 2G services, you can use it for 3G services
Technology
and
can't be
4G.
restricted,
Precisely.
Yeah.
So the point is, the intrinsic worth of this scarce, precious, finite, natural, national resource is far more. Now, obviously, the players are not happy. Why will they be happy? No, they will not. But now let's look at the estimates. Now, according to the TRAI, it should go up only by about 3% or so.
Yeah.
But let's say this is a gross underestimate. It might go up by 17%, 16%. But the fact is, telecom tariffs in India are among the lowest in the world at present. At present, today, you have something in the region, you are a country of 120, 1.2 crore people, you have something in the region of 900 million subscriptions, and estimates vary, but there's one view which says there are about something like 700 million subscribers. So there are 6 phones for every 10 Indians, or 7 phones for every 10 Indians.
That's a very good ratio.
Yeah, and in a city like this, you have more phones than even human beings. Now the issue is, once the spectrum prices go up, yes, there would be an increase in prices. There's no doubt about it. The fear is also, what will it do for rural telephony? Because the urban areas are completely saturated. As I was saying, there are more phones than human beings in most urban areas. But in the rural areas, that's where teledensity has to go. The TRAI has made certain calculations. They are saying not only is this spectrum going to be used for all kinds of services, they are saying the band, the whole process of what they call refarming of spectrum.
I'll come to that in a bit. What I also want to ask you before the refarming bit is that Unitech Wireless and System Asham, just take 2 companies, not all of them. Now, their biggest issue with these recommendations is that the reserve price, the minimum reserve price of that band of the spectrum has been kept unexpectedly high. If my figures are correct, a minimum of 3,622 crore for every megahertz in the 1800 megahertz category. A pan-India spectrum now for the 1800 megahertz band will now cost 18,000 crore. This is around 5 times.
Absolutely correct.
5 times the base price of 3G also.
Now what has happened, instead of it costing 1,600 crores, it's going to cost 16,000 or 18,000 crores. Mind you, these are the base prices. The actual prices may be even more. Now you see, you committed a major blunder in 2008. Today, the industry is having to pay the price for the sins of the past. Now, in a sense, their grievances are genuine because they are saying, what do we do now? But the point is, the industry knew exactly what was going on. At that time, you said, spectrum has to be kept low. Why? This is like a subsidy. This is the only way teledensity will go up. But look at the track record. The very fact that this 122 licenses which were issued from January 2008, and we come all the way 4 years down the line, they still have just 12% of the market. So still, about 88% of the market is still controlled by the existing players. And so, therefore, that nails the half-truth at best. I would say a downright lie, that it was because of cheap spectrum that you had more people using phones. The real reason was different. You had competition, you had the rollout. Now what has happened? Why are these licenses?
You believe this would reduce competition if these recommendations were accepted?
I'm not so sure at all. We already have the most competitive mobile telecom market anywhere in the world. We are the second biggest. Now the point is, many argue that this is going to actually make the big three, Bharti, Vodafone, Idea stronger. Now what happens to BSNL and MTN? Government policy has pushed them to the margins. Who's responsible? I mean, look at the manner in which the United Service, the USO, the United Service Obligation Fund has been used. The point is, the telecom sector has been seen a series of scams. This is an opportunity for the government to clean up the mess. And the government really doesn't have a choice, because the Supreme Court is directing the government what to do. It wanted 400 days. It hasn't been given 400 days. Now, it has to get its act together in the next 3 months or so.
It's September, I think, is
That's
the date
correct.
now. You talked about the big three: Vodafone, Bharti, and Tata. I think Idea.
That's correct.
Now, according to these guidelines, if they are accepted, these big three will have to shell out a cumulative total of rupees 95,000 crore to buy back the spectrum they already own.
Because
they're not going to like that, are they?
Obviously, they're not going to like that. But let's not forget 2 or 3 things. They got more spectrum than they were eligible to, what they were contractually obliged to. This has been pointed out by the Controller and Auditor General of India. Secondly, you're dealing with a scarce resource. As I said, it's a finite, natural, national resource. Today, you're having to pay the price. You didn't pay for it all these years.
Right.
Today, you're having to pay for it. Obviously, you're unhappy. Naturally, I mean, anybody in their position would be. But if you look at it from a bigger perspective, from a national perspective, this was almost inevitable. It had to happen because what you had was a series of scams.
Right.
Look, as far as spectrum is concerned, the scam didn't begin with Mr. Raja. It started long ago. It started in 1994 when Mr. Sukhram was a telecom minister. There were a series of scams of different types. You know, Mr. Sukhram is at 86. He's moving between the jail and the hospital for a violation with the CBI case, which many believe was a tip of the iceberg. But you look at the way in which words were interpreted, words like cumulative maximum. All of this was, you know, it sounds like a lot of technical jargon to a lot of people.
We'll take a small break right now. We'll come back and discuss. I have 2 more questions on TRI recommendations for you. Don't go anywhere. Take a short breather. Come back and we'll still be in conversation with Paranjoy, Guha, Thakurta. Take a break. Come back. Welcome back. You're still watching Policy Watch, and we're still in conversation with Paranjoy, Guha, Thakurta. Sir, we're still talking about the TRI recommendations right now. The big question on everyone's mind, of course, you mentioned it a little bit in your opening comments, is that will it make telephony a little more expensive in India? We've enjoyed a very long period of very, very affordable telephony. Do you think it's going to? Do you think the telcos are going to raise charges because it becomes capital intensive for them to bid for spectrum again?
I think that will happen. But the extent to which it will go up, I don't know. It all depends on how intense the competition is. Whether it goes up by 15%, 17% or 20%, my own hunch it will go up by somewhere in that region. But I want to make 2 other points, you know, in the context of what I was saying. The spectrum scam didn't begin with Mr. Raja. It started with Mr. Sukhram. And then there was a series of scams all pertaining to the manner in which spectrum was allotted. The Defense Department, the way it was supposed to get an optic fiber cable network. Bharat Sanchar Nigam Limited was to build it. It never got the money. So now Defense wants its spectrum because it's national security. Go back to Sukhram's time. You know, the licensing system changed while the BJP-led NDA was there. It changed into the revenue sharing system. What were the circumstances which led to Mr. Jagmohan's resignation? Then we had, when Mr. Shori, Mr. Pramod Mahajan were there, limited mobility to full mobility. WLL, that basically benefited one group, and that was the Reliance group. And then it goes on and on and on. So the way in which even earlier this phrase cumulative maximum was sought to be interpreted by the bureaucracy was again one more scam. So what we have is a series of scams culminating in Mr. Raja's 2G scam, which, you know, as the Controller and Auditor General says, 1,72,000 crores. But Mr. Kapil Sibal, of course, says there was 0 loss.
Some people would say that these recommendations also favor the Reliance Group highly. Would you agree with that?
You see, the thing is, these are the reserve prices. Suppose they go even higher than this. Would it still favor Reliance? Secondly, of course, Reliance has been favored. Reliance has been favored in the way the dual licensing system happened. Now, that hasn't come within the purview of this particular the judgment of the Supreme Court, but there are other cases pending. The fact of the matter is, Reliance paid for and got this dual technology license even before the policy was formally announced. Subsequently, Mr. Tata, the Tatas were the beneficiaries of this scam. In between, Mr. Tata wrote this laudatory letter to Mr. Karunanidhi and Mr. Raja. So all these things are part of the series of scandals pertaining to the spectrum. You see, if you look at a big picture, at one level, telecom is held as the showcase of economic liberalization.
sunshine sector,
Yes,
as we call
the success story of deregulation. But the problem is, this success story has an ugly underbelly, and that is the series of scams pertaining to the manner in which spectrum was misallocated and underpriced.
My last question on these guidelines would be, of course, the finance minister has been getting sleepless nights because of the fiscal deficit. Now, if they do get the estimated value, which is 7 times what they got last
Then they'll get 7 lakh crores.
Exactly.
They might get even more than that.
That would ease the government's fiscal troubles. But some would say that that would be taking 1 step forward and 3 steps backwards. Why? Because then it would impact private investment in the sunshine sector.
You know, the question is how much more, I mean, you already have a problem. I mean, this is an old story. The oil ministry wants the finance ministry to reduce the duties on petrol and diesel. So it's always one pocket of the government, the money moving from one pocket to the other. It's never as simple as that. Of course, the government, if the auctions come through, the government will get a lot of money. It'll help it reduce the fiscal deficit. The question is, what kind of investments will the government then put to increase rural telephony? So it's never a clear-cut win-win situation either. There are many, many shades of grey.
It's time to move on to our second story, Paranjoy. Of course, the international ratings agency Standard & Poor's has revised its outlook for India, taking it down from stable to negative. While the Indian government has been quick to point out that it is not a rating downgrade, Finance Minister Pranab Mukherjee has said that it's a timely warning, but there is no need to hit the panic button just yet. Our bureau filed this report. Take a look.
Citing India's burgeoning fiscal deficit and slim chances of progress on long-pending economic reforms, international rating agency Standard & Poor's has said that if the external position deteriorates and the deficit continues to widen, investment opportunities are likely to diminish. The government was quick to react to the news, with Finance Minister maintaining that the country would maintain a 7% level of growth this fiscal. The Finance Minister acknowledged that it was a timely warning, but also said that the negative outlook could have been stemmed from the delay in some key economic reform legislations.
Delay in the process of legislations, particularly certain legislations related to financial sector's reforms, might have been the reasons for coming to this conclusion.
India's long-term rating, according to S&P, is BBB, and the coveted rating might be at risk given the negative outlook report. The other big rating agency that maintains India's minimum investment rating is Moody's, which puts India at Baa3 currently. The rising subsidy burden on the government coffers has resulted in the fiscal deficit target of 4.6% of GDP being overshot. The deficit for the financial year ended in March settled at 5.9% of the GDP. Opposition parties were quick to jump at the opportunity provided by the negative outlook to attack the government and firing a salvo aimed at the government's governance record.
India can sustain its high growth rate only on the basis of increasing domestic demand. Only by empowering our own people, by increasing the domestic demand, you will have a healthy, sustainable growth cycle. But the government is doing the exact opposite.
Analysts believe that the government faces an arduous task ahead, as general elections in 2014 will further hamper efforts at reducing the subsidy burden through some hard economic reforms, something that could improve the investment climate in the country. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha TV.
There you go, a rating agency Standard & Poor's negative outlook for India. Now, first up, Paranjoy, let me ask you this. Rating agencies all over the world haven't really covered themselves in glory. They've been wrong before. Their conduct has been in question.
Their reputation is particularly tarnished because of the international economic recession, where they were found to be hand in glove, complicit with these big investment banks.
And their assessment of countries can be notoriously uneven. Now, should we be so worried, or should we be giving so much importance to some analyst who made a report at Standard & Poor's?
Not at all. One should not be excessively worried or concerned just because Standard & Poor's is saying something, or Moody's is saying something, or Fitch is saying something. Having said that, let's also accept the fact that there are a lot of problems with the way as far as the Indian economy is concerned. You know, I mean, okay, our rate of growth has slowed down. Inflation has slowed down, but there are signs that inflation may go up. There are huge problems before the country.
But
say the issue of oil prices. It's a huge problem. But whenever people talk about reforms, let me suggest that this word reforms means different things to different people. I mean, if you say, does reforms only mean foreign direct investment in multi-brand retail? Does reforms only mean that you increase the foreign direct investment cap on the insurance sector? Or does reforms mean movement towards full capital account convertibility? If that is your notion of reforms, then I dare say, forget the BJP or the communists, even within the Congress party, there's no consensus, leave alone the UP or Mamata Banerjee or DMK.
Right.
The second point is, if you want to look at, say, reforms, in my opinion, one of the big so-called economic reforms package, which is linked to this whole issue of our federal economy and our federal policy, is the whole issue of a common goods and services tax.
Absolutely.
You have to bring all the states together. Now, if that could happen, it would not only unify India's market, it would make it far more transparent, it would reduce the scope of corruption, and in my opinion, would be a major economic reform measure.
So landmark tax reform.
But are we moving in that direction? Are we moving towards implementing the direct taxes code? Are we doing away with the slew of exemptions given to the corporate sector? I'm not so sure. So, you know, it's how you want to look at that word reforms and what it means. So I am not particularly concerned whether Standard & Poor's is downgraded.
Neither is the finance minister. He seems unfazed, says we can grow by 7%, perhaps even more. But one good thing that might have come out of this negative outlook is that it's brought the current account deficit to the headlines. Normally, I was reading somewhere that normally inflation makes it the headlines. CAD is something that normal Aam Aadmi doesn't really like to know or doesn't understand. But this has brought the burgeoning deficit there. And
Yeah,
do you think
I mean, let's accept the fact that in the recently concluded financial year, our exports may have gone up by about 20% or 21%, but our imports have gone up by a far higher percentage, by about 35–36%. And the main reason for that is oil imports. Right now, India is importing 80% of the country's total requirements of crude oil. And we know, given the situation currently prevailing in West Asia, the Iran problem, Brent is still at a high of $120 a barrel. Crude, in general, average prices are in the region of $100 a barrel. So, despite the recession in Europe, despite that, we don't see any easing of oil prices. This is a matter of huge concern for India because it implies we're importing inflation. Government, because of political reasons, diesel prices are a very, very political sensitive issue. Cooking gas, kerosene, petrol prices you don't want to increase. So what's the choice? You don't want to increase petrol or petroleum product prices because that's going to spur inflation. If you don't do that, what happens? Your oil companies start bleeding. That's exactly the problem.
Last question on this story. Should we be bracing for a diesel hike, a sharp diesel hike, especially given the fact that could the government seize the opportunity, give it the last push, saying that, look, our investment image globally is taking a beating. This is the right time to go for a diesel hike?
Dr. Manmohan Singh and some of his supporters in the government, those who are firmly of the neoliberal, believers in the neoliberal school of economic policy or economic thought, they believe diesel prices should be decontrolled. If that actually happens, in my opinion, it's going to spur inflation. Diesel is what is economists call a universal intermediate. It enters into the transportation chain. What happens when transport costs go up, the prices of all the articles of mass consumption go up, and usually they have a ripple effect, so it goes up disproportionately higher. Therefore, you already have inflation, food inflation at close to double digits. It's going to go. That's going to lead to political discontent, a social unrest. All of that is bad news for a government which is already pretty beleaguered.
Lots for the government to think about. Another short break right now. We'll come back and talk about the Epfo interest rate. 2 questions on that. That's about it. Take a short break. Come back. We'll discuss the third story of Policy Watch this week. Welcome back to Policy Watch. Now, the interest rate on Employees' Provident Fund will be increased to 8.6% for the current fiscal, a move which will benefit around 5 crore subscribers. The Employees' Provident Fund organization, EPFO, had brought it down to 8.25% for 2011-12 from 9.5% provided in 2010-11. The interest rate was lowered last fiscal on the Finance Ministry's recommendation that with the kind of returns available, it was not possible to continue with the 9.5% given in the year-ago period. Now, Paranjoy, good news for employees, obviously, but do you think the interest rates for EPF from 8.25 to 8.6 is going to make much of a difference? It's just a 1.25% hike.
You know, all the trade unions and all the labor organizations across the country, including the one affiliated to the Congress Party, the INTUC, the Indian National Trade Union Congress, they were all very unhappy because you brought it down very sharply. So to some extent, they'll feel a little happier, but it's not that labor unions or even the organized sector will be happy. Let's accept, okay, the organized sector are in a minority. The majority of people who work in this country are in the informal, the unorganized sector. They don't have any security of employment. But the EPFO has always been seen as it's akin to a social safety net. And despite what the government is saying, many people see this as, why not subsidize? If you are, a subsidy seems to be a dirty word, but what's wrong in subsidizing, your workers? You don't like subsidies on kerosene, on cooking gas, or diesel, or on EPFO, but at the same time, you're giving concessions to the corporate sector, and that's running into, 5 lakh crores and 6 lakh crores. So somewhere along the line, I think the government also has to get its priorities right.
So you're saying it's a good move, but they could have done more? Is that what you're saying?
Certainly the employees would have liked
more.
much more.
Right.
But given what it was, the fact that it's increased at this time is at least a little better for the organized workforce.
Fair point, Paranjoy. That's where we end our show today. Thank you so much for joining us on Policy Watch. That was Paranjoy Guha Thakurta joining us on Policy Watch. I'll have to thank him again one more time for coming. Of course, what came out of the discussion today was our top story was TRI recommendations. Telcos are not going to like it at all. Some people call it a regressive regulatory step. We'll have to wait and see whether the minimum reserve price stays where it is right now or even increases when the recommendations finally go to the cabinet. The second story we discussed today was, of course, the S&P downgrade. It's not a downgrade, negative outlook for India. Paranjoy seems to think, and as does the finance minister, that there's no real cause for worry. We might just grow at 7%, perhaps even beyond that. And just because the ratings agency says so, we shouldn't have to worry about it. EPFO, of course, they'd be happy. Employees all over the country will be happy. They could have got some more. They could have expected some more. That's all we have time for from Policy Watch this week. Until next time, when we give you another guest, another 3 issues, top economic stories of the week. It's goodbye from me, Athar Khan. Thank you for watching.